Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Scotland at 7. It's the 30th of September 2019. I'm Gordon Ross. In this evening's news, the BBC discipline controversy involving newsreader Naga Munchetty on the BBC's morning breakfast programme has continued, with the involvement also of her co-host Dan Walker. Now, according to the original complaint that led to the BBC's Naga Munchetty being disciplined over her comments about Donald Trump was also about her co-host, Dan Walker, according to the correspondence seen by the Guardian newspaper, in an apparent contradiction of the corporation's assertion that there had been no such complaint about his role. After the BBC ruled last week that Munchetty had breached editorial guidelines, in a conversation with Walker about Donald Trump, the corporation defended itself against anger that only a woman of colour had been punished and not her white male co-host, by insisting its hands were tied. The BBC's editorial standards chief, David Jordan, twice suggested in interviews that the high-level executive complaints unit was able to consider only Munchetty's role in the segment, even though Walker had made similar points, had asked the questions which prompted her remarks, because she was the sole subject of the complaint. Now, this is a piece of news, actually, which, I don't know about you, but I actually watched the BBC's breakfast programme, and I witnessed this particular interchange between the two presenters. And Naga Munchetty was basically asked a hypothetical question, it seemed, by her co-host, asking if it ever happened to her, if she had ever had somebody tell her to go back where she came from. And she said yes, and it was an ingrained racial slur, and something which she had witnessed pretty frequently, apparently. But it seems that only Naga was being disciplined by the BBC, and this seemed unfair. So now we've got Dan Walker, her co-host, also being embroiled in this row over whether she actually was complaining about Donald Trump, which actually, if you watch back in the exchange between the two, she wasn't, and she actually explicitly said that she wasn't talking about anybody in particular, but just simply that as a woman of colour she had had this experience many times. Now, moving on from this story, the UK government's opposition parties have met this week to plan how to block a no-deal Brexit, especially from taking place against Parliament's will. The UK government's Green Party leader the UK Parliament's Green Party leader Caroline Lucas said on Monday that the opposition is completely united about stopping no deal. The parties, including the Labour Party and the Scottish National Party, are concerned that the Prime Minister Boris Johnson of the Conservative Party may not adhere to a new law requiring him to seek a Brexit extension if no divorce deal is reached with the European Union. Britain is set to leave the EU on October 31st unless it seeks an extension and one is granted. Boris Johnson has said he plans to leave on that day with or without a Brexit divorce agreement. Now, connected to this, Jackson Carlaw, the acting head of the Scottish Tory group, has also made a drastic U-turn this week, it seems, and has abandoned his promise to avoid a disastrous no deal. The SNP today said that the Scottish Tories are guilty of a shameful failure to stand up for Scotland by supporting a disastrous Brexit and putting the demands of Boris Johnson ahead of the interests of Scotland. The SNP said it has led the way in ensuring Brexit can be stopped and in bringing Parliament back into action after the Tories sought to shut down UK democracy. And according to SNP spokesman, also said that we'll continue to work with all opposition MPs to stop the growing no-deal Brexit threat to Scotland's economy. With all of the threat to Scotland's economy, jobs, living standards and public services. It is time for the opposition parties to unite and show leadership that has been severely lacking from the UK government. And as recent events have shown, we simply can't afford to leave Scotland's future in Boris Johnson's hands. Boris Johnson's threat to ignore British law which requires him to request a Brexit extension, has been raised at a summit of top European politicians. Scottish Labour MP Ian Murray alerted foreign parliamentarians on the Council of Europe to the situation in Strasbourg. The Committee of Ministers is the Council of Europe's statutory decision-making body and is made up of the ministers of foreign affairs of member states. The Council of Europe has 47 member states, including the EU and non-EU countries. Ian Murray, the MP for Edinburgh South and a Labour Party representative on the Council of Europe, said, "After Boris Johnson last week told me in the House of Commons that he would not obey the law, I raised this undemocratic threat to flout the Safeguarding Act with our European partners. It's important that our allies are aware of this brazen threat from the Prime Minister. It is not for governments of any democratic country to try and find ways to disobey the law, and Boris Johnson is not above the law. We need to secure the extension and then work to give the British people a final say on Brexit with a positive campaign to remain in the EU." Now, the Scottish National Party have also waded into the row over Jackson Carlaw's remarks and have put out a press release today which basically is saying that the Scottish Tories are guilty of a shameful failure to stand up for Scotland by supporting a disastrous no-deal Brexit. The Scottish Tory leader Jackson Carlaw fell into line, saying that he would back plans to leave the EU on the 31st of October, even if there was no deal agreed by Brussels. It comes just 2 months after Ruth Davidson had said the Scottish Tories won't support a no-deal Brexit. In commenting, the SNP's MP Pete Wishart said, "It's no surprise that the Scottish Tories have fallen into line behind their Westminster bosses and are now card-carrying do-or-die Brexiteers. It is shameful that not a single Scottish Tory can bring themselves to stand up for the principles, to stand up for Scotland against the extreme Brexit, and even at this critical moment for our country. The so-called leadership of the Scottish Tories have steadily abandoned all of their principles to sign up fully with Boris Johnson's no-deal Brexit, with all the disastrous consequences that would have for Scotland's jobs, our economy and our public services. No wonder the Tories are running scared of the verdict of the Scottish people, whether that be in a general election or in the option of choosing a better future as an independent nation." There is also some more detail from the SNP here, but before I get to that, let me just read out some excerpts from what's happened with the Scottish Conservative Party's interim leader and what he's actually been saying. The Scottish Conservative Party's leader, or interim leader, Jackson Carlaw, has said the UK should leave the EU on the 31st of October with or without a deal, rolling back on the policy of his former leader, Ruth Davidson. Ms Davidson, considered a moderating force in the Conservative Party, resigned as leader in the aftermath of Boris Johnson's decision to suspend Parliament, a move which has since been found to be unlawful by the Supreme Court. And during her time at the head of the party's operations north of the border, she repeatedly spoke out against a no-deal Brexit, and writing in July, "I do not think the government should pursue a no-deal Brexit, and if it comes to it, I won't support it." However, Jackson Carlaw, the interim leader who took up the mantle from Miss Davidson, has opted instead to toe the party line and support Boris Johnson's strict adherence to leaving the bloc. "The Prime Minister and the government will obey the law," Mr Carlaw has told the BBC from outside Conservative Party's conference, "but I believe that we should leave on October the 31st, whether or not we have a deal." Speaking of the need for opposition parties to get behind Mr Johnson, he added, We need to back the Prime Minister and the government as they seek to arrive at a fresh arrangement. That's the right way forward for the country, and I don't think anybody can surely disagree with that. It comes after the stand-in leader used a speech at a fringe event at the conference to praise his former leader's legacy, heralding her as a ferocious force of energy and her strong and instinctive sense of political purpose. However, asked to explain why he had turned his back on her Brexit stance, he said, "It would be far more damaging to drag out the Brexit process. And Ruth has got very firm views," he added. "Everybody has views on Brexit. My preference is for a negotiated way out. It always has been. But I'm not someone who has argued that the roof will fall in on the world in an alternative scenario if we have properly prepared for it. I think the effort now to properly prepare for it is underway. There are a whole series of other agreements that will apply, irrespective of whether we come out of the European Union with a broader comprehensive deal that we want to see happen. Far more damaging is the endless drift, 3 years after we've voted, 3 years of businesses not knowing whether they're going to, sorry, I think it's a misprint, where they're going to end up. Another 6-month extension does not guarantee that anything will be any different at the end of it. And at some point you have to say we have to move on, and I think we are at that point now. So we can see a complete changeover from the previous position of the Scottish Conservative Party in Mr Carlaw's new comments. Now moving on to our next subject this evening, we're still largely staying with the government and its current Brexit plans. And this time we're looking at this from the point of view of the SNP and their demand that Prime Minister attends PMQs amid Brexit chaos. Boris Johnson cannot be allowed free pass to duck scrutiny. With less than a month to go until the UK is set to leave the EU, the SNP has demanded that Boris Johnson turn up to Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday and be held accountable for the Brexit crisis, after Number 10 revealed today that he does not plan to attend. Since Boris Johnson took office in July, there has only been one opportunity for MPs to hold the Prime Minister to account at PMQs for his actions due to his unlawfully proroguing Parliament. In commenting, Stuart Hosey MP said, "With just under a month to go, the UK risks crashing out of the EU without a deal, and Boris Johnson threatening to subvert the law again by refusing to ask for an extension if he fails to get a deal. It is downright shameful that he plans to dodge PMQs and refuses to be held accountable for his actions leading to this Brexit chaos." Now that the Parliament has resumed after the Tories unlawfully tried to shut it down, MPs must now be able to scrutinise his actions as Prime Minister. It is outrageous that we have only had one chance to do so since he took office. Boris Johnson, of all people, cannot be allowed a free pass to duck scrutiny, given recent events which have shown how unfit for office he is. Scotland's future cannot be left in the hands of a dangerous Prime Minister who is threatening to break the law again and impose an extreme Brexit that would cost thousands of jobs and livelihoods. So that from the SNP today. In other news concerning Mr Johnson, there is another story circulating today that it is possible that the Queen might be able to dismiss Boris Johnson as Prime Minister if he refused to comply with the law requiring him to seek an extension to Brexit talks. This coming from the leading Remainer Dominic Grieve. The former Attorney General said that the Prime Minister would be out in 5 minutes if he tried to defy a Supreme Court order to go to Brussels. Mr Grieve said he expected the current attorney, Geoffrey Cox, and the Lord Chancellor, Robert Buckland, would resign, while the civil service would withdraw cooperation, with the Prime Minister openly flouting the law in this way. So it appears that Mr Grieve is basically saying that the civil service would not work with a Prime Minister who breaks the law. A cross-party group of anti-no deal MPs has passed legislation known as the Benn Act earlier this month, which requires Mr Johnson to seek an extension to the Article 50 Brexit extension, delaying the date of the withdrawal until the end of January next year, if he has not secured parliamentary approval for a deal or a no-deal outcome by the 19th of October. So not very long to go now, just slightly less than 3 weeks until all of this finally comes to a head. Mr Johnson has branded the legislation a Surrender Act in his own inimitable language, and insists that despite its provisions, he will not ask Brussels for an extension beyond the scheduled Brexit date of the 31st of October. But Mr Grieve said that that would lead to an instant legal challenge, which would reach the Supreme Court within days, where judges would issue a rarely used order known as a mandamus, requiring a public official to carry out non-discretionary responsibility. he would be taken to court and a writ of mandamus would be issued against him, and he would be told that he had, as a matter of law, to write the letter, Mr. Grieve told Sky News. I suspect the courts could deal with it very quickly. Mr. Grieve added, at this stage, the Cabinet Secretary and the Civil Service will refuse to work with them. I assume the Attorney General and Lord Chancellor would have resigned because it is such a flagrant breach of law. Even though Mr. Cox had been a vocal supporter of Mr. Johnson's approach to Brexit, Mr. Grieve said that he was a good enough lawyer to know that you can't support a Prime Minister who is breaking the law of the land. When pressed on whether Mr. Johnson would face further legal action if he refused to comply with a court order, Mr. Grieve said, there is no question of putting the Prime Minister on trial. The Supreme Court, Her Majesty's judges, telling the Prime Minister that as a matter of law he has to do something, well, he'll be gone in 5 minutes, he'll be dismissed. Asked if it was the Queen who would dismiss Mr. Johnson in these circumstances, Mr. Grieve simply replied, yes. The former Attorney General insisted that this was a hypothetical position, but he added, if he intends to continue to behave in this completely ludicrous fashion, then yes, perhaps. So it looks as if, at least technically speaking, it's possible that Boris Johnson could actually be sacked by the monarch. Another one of these bizarre situations that Brexit has thrown up in recent days. And speaking of bizarre things that have been thrown up in recent days, brings me to our next story this evening. This is an allegation about the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and dates back 20 years as I understand it. And Boris Johnson has been accused of groping a journalist 20 years ago during a political meal. Boris Johnson has been forced to deny an allegation that he groped a female journalist as the Conservatives sought to put their party conference in Manchester back on track with a day devoted to public services and the economy. But during a visit to business premises in the city, the Prime Minister was asked whether the allegation made by the Sunday Times journalist Charlotte Edwards was actually true. No, and I think that what the public want to hear about is what we're doing to level up and unite the country, he said. Asked if she had made it up, Johnson simply said, I'm just saying what I've said. What the public want to hear is what we are doing for them and the country and the investment in ways of uniting the country. So he hasn't actually made a denial here. This is basically Boris has deflected the question, it seems, and hasn't answered it. Ms Edwards claimed at the lunch in 1999 that Boris Johnson groped her leg under a table, grabbing enough flesh beneath his fingers to make her sit upright, according to her. She also alleged that he did the same to another woman at the same event. Mary Wakefield, a commissioning editor at The Spectator and the wife of Prime Minister's chief advisor Dominic Cummings, issued a statement saying that she was not the woman referred to in the article. But Boris was a good boss and nothing like this ever happened to me, she said. So there are a lot of he said and she said stories here. But Downing Street initially declined to comment on Sunday, but after senior ministers were questioned repeatedly about the claim, a Number 10 spokesperson said the allegation is untrue. It is unusual for Number 10 to issue denials of. We do not want. They don't particularly want to answer questions about personal matters of any sitting MPs. We're now going to move on to another story, but concerning a different Conservative MP. This is concerning Owen Paterson. Now, Owen Paterson is a former cabinet minister and is facing questions today over his conduct after documents revealed that he helped to lobby for two firms which he was paid to advise. Owen Paterson, a former Conservative Environment Secretary and a prominent Brexit supporter, took part in lobbying campaigns for the firms to promote their products. But the documents obtained by the Guardian newspaper revealed that he had several meetings with officials and another with a minister. He also wrote asking them to take steps that would benefit a food manufacturer and a healthcare firm. The documents raise questions over whether the North Shropshire MP has actually broken any parliamentary rules that permit MPs to lobby on behalf of a paying client. So moving on from this story, we are now looking at, again, I beg your pardon, we're now moving to another story on the impact of Brexit on red meat, and the red meat sector in particular. Now, because of Brexit, export costs would be set to increase. The non-tariff cost of exporting red meat to the EU could increase by up to £276 per shipment in the event of a no-deal Brexit, according to new research. The study estimates that the administrative cost for the red meat sector exporting to the EU under World Trade Organization rules is likely to increase as a result of additional costs associated with veterinary inspections. This is before the businesses contend with the potential tariffs on red meat as high as 45 to 50%, which would further impact Scotland's export price competitiveness, and the increased costs linked to the transportation and insurance. Now, Rural Economy Secretary Fergus Ewing has said that a no-deal Brexit is by far the biggest threat to our red meat sector and our successful food industry. This research is further evidence that Scotland's red meat sector could be worse off under every scenario when compared with current trading arrangements. With the export market already highly competitive, any additional costs involved with exporting to our largest trading partner post-Brexit is likely to put sales and therefore businesses and jobs at risk. The UK government should look at the weight of evidence collated over the last 3 years about the potential impact of no deal on industries such as this and take it off the table once and for all. So this from the Scottish Government's Rural Economy Secretary Fergus Ewing. Now, moving on from Brexit to something else now, and the UK government has been told to cough up its fair share of broadband funding. Oh, I beg your pardon. We have an item on fishing in here as well. Do apologise. Yeah. Okay, so we'll just find that story for you now. Okay, yes, I beg your pardon. Britain and Norway have signed an agreement to allow fishermen of both countries to continue to fish in each other's waters in case Britain leaves the European Union on the 31st of October, the two governments said on Monday. This agreement ensures that the existing arrangements based on the EU agreement with Norway will remain in place until the end of 2019. Arrangements for 2020 onwards are currently being negotiated, the British government added in a statement. So it seems that so much for taking back control of fishing. We're actually still in the same situation after a no-deal Brexit with no agreement in place for the fishing industry. And it appears that perhaps the fishing rights might even be given away as part of the bargaining for this no-deal Brexit or post-no-deal Brexit arrangement with the EU. Now, because I got myself out of sequence there, I am now back to the broadband funding story. Now, the UK government has been told to cough up its fair share in broadband funding for Scotland. The SNP warned the UK government against bypassing the Scottish government in a move that could see Scotland losing out. The SNP has warned that the Chancellor must cough up Scotland's fair share in funding for broadband and digital infrastructure, including 5G, and warned that the funding must come directly to Scotland and not as part of a bidding war that could see Scotland losing out. Following the Chancellor's broadband funding announcement at the Tory conference, Drew Hendry MP warned that Scotland had been consistently shortchanged by the Tories at Westminster as they failed time and time again in addressing the broadband and connectivity needs of Scotland. The SNP MP also called for transparency over funding for devolved nations, echoing findings in a report published earlier this month by Westminster Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee, which concluded that funding to devolved nations should be based on need and taking into account geography and remoteness rather than just the Barnett allocations. The Scottish Government received just £21 million in funding from the Tory government despite broadband being a matter reserved to Westminster. This amounts to just 3.5% of the total funding for broadband in Scotland, with the other £580 million coming from the SNP government. Drew Hendry, MP, the SNP's BEIS spokesman, said that time and time again Scotland has been shortchanged by the Tory government in Westminster when it comes to delivering for our communities and our regions. With the Chancellor's broadband and connectivity funding announcement, it's high time the Tories coughed up for Scotland's fair share of funding and made clear that the money will come straight to Scotland and not as part of a bidding war, which has seen Scotland lose out before. On broadband and connectivity, the Scottish Government's plans to provide 100% access to superfast broadband are still the most ambitious of any government, with the highest ever investment by any government in these islands. All the UK government has offered to do, all they have offered to do is a leadership pledge from Boris Johnson and an unambitious target. It's clear that communities across Scotland have been an afterthought for the Tories, and there must be greater transparency over funding allocations and the process for devolved nations, as echoed by a cross-party Westminster committee earlier this month. The UK government must act before more communities lose out on vital funding and services. Okay, let's leave the story of the internet and move to this next story is a much more serious subject, I'm afraid, but something which is not talked about very much in Scotland. This is news today from the Scottish Government and COSLA. This is the Organisation of Scottish Local Authorities, on Scotland's National Suicide Prevention Leadership Group, and this is a report from this group. The Public Health Minister, Joe Fitzpatrick, pardon me, and the COSLA spokesperson for Health and Social Care, Peter Johnson, have said, over the past decade, we as a country have made real progress in reducing deaths by suicide, but there is still more to do. We firmly believe that every life matters and no death in suicide is acceptable, nor inevitable. We welcome this annual report by Scotland's National Suicide Prevention Leadership Group, and they have put the voices of those with direct experience at the centre of their work. And the report shows their intention to put that experience alongside other evidence and a robust research approach, which will support the reduction in the rate of deaths by suicide. The Scottish Government and COSLA have given careful consideration to the contents of the report and the recommendations made. The Scottish Government and COSLA accept the recommendations and, further, both hope that these recommendations will be used to drive forward further work across key partners to prevent suicides. It's important that we continue to raise awareness and to promote more understanding of suicide in our society, and we want a Scotland where help and support is available in every community to anyone contemplating suicide or to people who have lost loved ones to suicide. In response to the recommendations made in this report, the Scottish Government and COSLA will work together to facilitate engagement between key partners, both locally and nationally, to work with the group. There is more information on suicide and what to do if you are affected by this by contacting the National Suicide Prevention Leadership Group. I have some more information here on Samaritans for those of you who might need that. You can contact Samaritans free 24 hours a day on short code 116123 or by www.samaritans.org online. So if you have been affected by suicide or your family has been affected, then there are places where you can turn for help. The Scottish Government, now moving on from this information on the Suicide Prevention Leadership Group, we're now moving back to a subject which has been in the news a lot recently, which if I can find it would help, which is climate change. And the Scottish Government has made a change to the planning permissions necessary for people wishing to install things like wind turbines or solar panels in an effort to make it easier and faster to produce your own electricity locally. So this, again, another government policy of trying to increase the numbers of methods of locally generating power. And these changes are at the proposal stage at the moment, but it is hoped that they will, once published and acted on, make it easier for people in particularly rural areas to action things like wind turbine planning consents and so forth. Our last story this evening is to do with sporting equality and levelling the playing field for women and girls. Now, this is something which has been in the news a lot recently, with women's football now attracting enormous crowds and massive television audiences across the globe. This is a response here from this is from Fiona Pringle, and this is a summit to increase media coverage of women in sport and to encourage girls to be more active. And it has been recommended in a report today. An expert group says that women and girls will be more likely to take up a sport or exercise if there is increased reporting of top athletes and events in the media. The group, which is made up of leaders from sport, business and media, has recommended a Scottish Sport Media Summit be established to review and challenge the nature and extent of existing media coverage in Scotland. The report, which comes at the start of Scottish Women and Girls in Sport Week 2019, also highlights the need for greater gender balance in leadership and management roles across Scottish sport. The Public Health Minister Joe Fitzpatrick has said recent high-profile sporting events such as FIFA's Women's World Cup, the Solheim Cup and Vitality Netball World Cup have been watched, enjoyed and experienced by huge audiences. The increased visibility has not only shone a light on inspirational role models, but has led to a rise in participation. There is much to be proud of, and by accepting the board's recommendations, we'll work towards a level playing field where everyone is treated fairly and can achieve their full potential. Scottish Women and Girls in Sport Advisory Board Chair Amanda Jones has said, "We passionately believe that measures to increase activity levels of women and girls will make Scotland a better place to live for all of us. Our recommendations in this report are challenging, but we commend them to the Scottish Government. The summer of 2019 was a momentous time for women's sport, both in Scotland and globally, and it's important that we continue to build from that." So that from the Scottish Women and Girls in Sport Advisory Board today. That is about it from us tonight on Scotland at 7. But as usual, before I leave you tonight, just a reminder that it does cost money, a large amount of money, to make television programmes for you. So here at Broadcasting Scotland, we rely on your help and support to help us to make the programmes that you like to watch. So on your screen now is advice on how to go about becoming a supporter of Broadcasting Scotland. Anyway, that's about it from us tonight. It is a September weekend in Glasgow, so we are also a little we are a bit short on staff, and so a slightly shorter show tonight. But I will be back again Thursday night with another edition of Scotland at 7. But from all of us here at Broadcasting Scotland, very good night to you.